Welcome back. If you're new, you can have me scuttling around inside your skull by subscribing. Click the bell notification and you won't miss anything. 3 true horror stories set in hospitals. The GRIN. My sister, who I'll call Susan, works in a mental facility in West Virginia. She works on the forensic unit, which is a ward set aside for those with chronic mental illness. The patients range from the paranoid schizophrenic who listen to the voices no one else can hear, from people no one else can see, to people whose grip on reality simply slipped away. And as a result they committed heinous crimes with little or no understanding what they did was wrong. These are the true psychopaths, more terrifying than some machete-wielding villain in a slasher movie. Susan had not been working there for very long, and those starting out worked the graveyard shift, coming in at around 10 at night and clocking out at about 8 AM. One of the first things they tell you is never open a patient room without an assistant nurse. That's because the chronically mentally ill are very strong, abnormally so, and dangerous and unpredictable, even if they are medicated. The ward was on the 6th floor and there were 14 rooms in all, 7 on each side of the hall. And at the end of the hall is a large open day room with a TV and couches and tables and chairs. But as all the patients were in bed at night, that room was empty and the assistant nurses would go in and sweep and dust and straighten things up. Every half hour or so, a nurse goes down the hall and checks on the patients. She has her tablet and she checks each patient and makes notes about whether they are asleep, if they are awake or seem to be restless in their sleep. She makes a note of it and leaves it for the doctor in the morning, who will see if there needs to be an adjustment to their medication. The nurse would go up to the door and quietly open the observation flap, check on the patient sleeping in their dimly lit room, and make her note and move on. No patient room is entirely dark. It is dimly lit, but never pitch dark. All the rooms were occupied except for room 15. Oh yeah, you heard that right. I said room 15. You see, the chronically mentally ill develop these little phobias, and they don't like being in a room numbered 13, sort of like in hotels that way. There's no floor 13 or room number 13. On this particular night, everyone seemed to be fine. They were all asleep, and as my sister made her rounds, she peeked into the day room and saw that the television was still on. So she went over and turned it off, and picked up a scrap of paper and straightened a magazine, and put a deck of cards away, and then she headed back up the hall where she heard something coming from room 15. She frowned. There was no one to be in room 15. She checked her tablet screen and saw the room was vacant. In fact, she had never known the room to be occupied. She listened closer and heard a soft moaning sound. She raised the flap and looked in, and there, on the bare mattress, was a small figure in the upper corner of the bed, their face looking towards the wall. Susan ran up the hall and stopped at the nursing station. Helen, the supervising nurse, was at the desk, and an assistant nurse, Frank, was standing there beside her. "Frank, you better come with me right now. There's someone in room 15. How come no one told me there had been a patient moved in there?" Frank just stood there and looked at Helen, and she nodded and said, "You better come around and sit down, Susan. I have a story to tell you." My sister sat down and Helen turned in her revolving desk chair to face her. Now, what I am about to tell you is something the administration don't like to be told, though it happened when you were just a little girl. but since you have seen Evelyn, you should know about her. The hospital had been built in the 70s. It was modern for that time and meant to take some of the more chronic patients off the hands of the state-run hospital. There were blood-curdling stories about conditions in the state hospital back then, about it being practically a sort of bedlam, with patients wandering around on open wards, and the noises of crying and talking and screaming and singing. Then there were the patients who just stood there, unable to do anything but stare. Helen had never worked there, but she heard all about it. Helen and Evelyn had just graduated from nursing school, and they applied to the hospital as they heard they were paying really good wages, and the two girls could do with the money. The hospital had hired most of the graduating class, but most quit in a few months, but Helen and Evelyn hung in there. The people who were put in there were the Charlie Mansons and the Ted Bundys of the world, and they were simply so creepy to be around, and too eerie for most people, but they stuck it out. A person had to be made of a pretty tough metal to work there, and some days it was tough to do even for the two friends. They got this one patient they called the GRIN. The GRIN was a young man who was extremely violent. By all accounts, he was an attractive young man, but you could tell just by looking at him that he had no soul. He was tall, with a head full of dirty blonde hair, and eyes so pale he looked almost blind. He looked like the sort of man an artist would use as a model for an angel like the ones in the garden of the Catholic hospital nearby. But the GRIN was no angel. In fact, he was Lucifer himself. There had been a string of really gruesome murders in nearby Kentucky. 5 girls had been murdered in the most gruesome way. The GRIN would chew off their lower faces to their jugular, which were the cause of death. He was finally caught and put on trial. The papers were the ones who named him the GRIN, not for the way he murdered the victims, but because during the whole trial he just sat there, not saying a word, just grinning. Doctors, nurses and staff had all followed the case at the hospital, and they received word that the GRIN was to be sent to them, and they had a series of meetings about how to deal with him. His medical orders were extensive. He was on a strong cocktail of antipsychotics and sedatives, and he was put on a liquid diet since they would not be giving him utensils, and his liquid meal was served to him in a paper cup. His hands were to be shackled and a muzzle put on when they had to interact with him, and only with 2 assistant nurses present. His medications had to be injected. They brought him in a wheelchair and shackles, dressed already in the hospital clothes the patients there wore, and a robe. At the time it was a rainy day and his hair was damp. He stared straight forward as he was checked in formally. The deputies who brought him signed him in and gave the doctor the orders from the prison doctor, and they took him from there. They took his picture, which he just stared blankly as the camera flashed, and then they wheeled him into his room. His hands were uncuffed, and he just sat on the bed, obediently. The hospital staff expected him to be quite different, a raging wild animal, and he simply wasn't. And in a way, equally unnerving was how soft-spoken he was. His voice was low and deep and soft, gentle even. When nurses brought him his supper, he thanked them kindly, and when he was given an order, he followed commands to the letter. He quietly went to the showers, and while he was away the nurses would change his bed linens, and he would come back and thank them for changing and making his bed. One night Evelyn was walking the hall, her clipboard in her hand, doing her bed check when she noticed the GRIN seemed to have been sick in the night, as his sheets had some sort of stain on them. He had been there a year and never offered to harm any of them. So without a single thought in her head, she unlocked the door and went in. He was on her before she knew what happened. He silenced her scream with a quick wrench, and then he did what he usually did and had sort of balled her up on the corner of his bed and faced her towards the wall. An assistant nurse who was passing by noted the door ajar and he pulled the alarm and went in. The GRIN was sitting on the floor opposite the bed, staring straight ahead, his clothes covered in blood. The assistant ordered him to lay down on his stomach and he complied. The assistant nurse cuffed him and he pulled out a muzzle and secured his mouth and then went over and touched the woman on the shoulder. Evelyn's body flopped back effortlessly. She was dead. The assistant nurse stared at her for a moment and turned only when he heard the GRIN chuckling. After that happened, the GRIN was transferred to a psychiatric prison in Virginia, and another nurse was hired to replace Evelyn. They had heard sometime later the GRIN was murdered by another inmate. It wasn't too long though before a nurse came running up the hall saying there was something wrong with the patient in room 15. Susan asked Helen, "Has anyone ever gone in there?" "No one has ever gone in there, Susan, and there has been many who have seen the figure in the corner of the bed, face to the wall, crying." Susan asked, "If it is just Evelyn, why doesn't anyone go in? Maybe send her on." The older nurse then said, "You didn't hear it?" My sister responded saying, "I heard the crying." Helen said, "No, not just the crying. The chuckling. The GRIN is in there too." The night shift. I'm a doctor and I work in one of those large hospitals with lots of long corridors connecting buildings. It's like a giant warren. I was working the late shift and in the middle of the night, the switchboard put the call through to my telephone to assist a cardiac arrest. So being a part of the team that night, it was all hands on deck. I ran out of my office and the longest corridor that's usually busy during the daytime was empty. Thankfully, I knew exactly where I was going. Ward 12, main tower block, 2nd floor. I can get to it by going by the rear lifts at the back of the reception area beyond the T-bar. Oh, times like this I wish they had a corridor go-kart for night duty doctors only. I was 3/4 of the way running down this corridor and I could see someone walking towards me from the other end, and eventually this man asked me where the mortuary was. I continued talking to him, walking quickly the other way giving him directions, and the stranger thanked me, understanding I was in a hurry, and eventually I made it to Ward 12, got to the patient's bed. The patient didn't make it. I looked at the deceased and recognised the man. It was the same man who just asked me where the mortuary was in the corridor. A Christmas night in hospital. George was an assistant nurse. He was working nights at the hospital. It was Christmas at the time, so some wards were closed and all the lights were off, so it was really dark. As he was walking down a closed ward at 3 in the morning, he nearly bumped into an old man with a gown on. George thought it was odd as it was so late and he should have been asleep and not in the area. But as you can guess, some patients like to go for a stroll. George spoke to him and said, "Oh, sorry, didn't see you there." And the old man turned around and walked into one of the rooms in the ward. George decided that he should help and take him back to the ward he was from, back to the nurses and then back to his bed. George immediately walked into the room the old man went into, but it was completely empty. If you enjoy listening to my voice, watch another video right now. and remember to subscribe. Leave me a comment. I'd love to know your thoughts. And one of you listening right now is going to have me knock on your window in 4, 3, 2,